It's about that feedback loop to make sure that you haven't missed the mark. And also it ends up being better because of the active input that you're getting from your marketplace. So that experimentation in front of people is actually what ends up making it that you will have a superior product, again, whether that's a piece of content or whatever the experiment might be.
Patience is a virtue. Does hearing that just make you want to scream? When I was growing up, I must have heard this phrase 100 times a day. I'm someone who, like most entrepreneurs, wants immediate results. I want to pull a trigger and see it work. Not wait around for weeks or months, being patient. But patience really does make a huge difference when you're talking about a business. And whether or not you consider it a virtue, it is a necessary part of running a successful business. I'm Susan Bowles, and you're listening to Break the Ceiling, the show where we break down unconventional strategies you can use to save time, boost your profit, and increase your operational capacity. This month, we've been talking about all the various ways that founders can muck up their own success, ways that we get in our own way, and the practical tools you can use to stop sabotaging your progress. So far, I've talked to Michelle Warner about how to stop getting in your own way by avoiding processes. I've talked to Tanya Dalton about how to stop getting in your own way by overwhelming your to-do list. I've talked to Agnes Kowalski about how to stop getting in your own way by letting your stories and beliefs around money create artificial limitations to your growth. And I've talked to Nicole Lewis-Keeber about how to stop getting in your own way by letting your past create a wall that you keep running into over and over again as you try to grow. Today, we're talking about patience. So if you get in your own way by rushing ahead on your ideas without creating a plan, or you get antsy when you don't see results right away, or you scrap projects when it starts taking longer than you expected, stick around. Often, we come up with new ideas, we launch them, and then get disappointed that they don't work. So we shift to something else or create something new and run through that whole cycle again. But what if it was a great idea and you just didn't give it a chance to succeed? Maybe you didn't give it enough time, or devote enough resources to it, or tell enough people about it. Maybe you didn't market it to the right people or in the right way. Maybe this thing that you created is actually a great thing, and you just didn't have enough patience with it. Today, I'm talking to Jason Van Orden. He's a consultant, trainer, and strategist who helps thought leaders reach larger audiences. He's created multiple successful brands, launched over 60 online courses, taught more than 10,000 entrepreneurs, and has over 8 million downloads of his podcast. So he knows a little something about seeing things through. And we're talking about how to test and implement new ideas, how to see them through, and the strategies and tools you can put in place to make sure you're giving your projects every chance to succeed. Hey, Jason, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah. Hi, Susan. My pleasure.
So, we are all entrepreneurs. We always have a ton of ideas. How do you decide, either personally or how do you advise your clients to decide which ideas to actually pursue?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's something that I refer to a little framework that I have just called the aligned business strategy. It's nothing fancy in the name or really in how it's constructed, but it's a very powerful thing. And I often start here with clients because there's always a little bit of realignment, or at the very least, informing a decision, as you're saying here. And so, if you were to imagine two circles and a Venn diagram, and where those circles overlap is where we want our business strategy to fall at any given time. And the two circles are made up of you and then your target market or your audience. And in the you circle are things like what your vision is for the future of your business, for you personally, your lifestyle, your career, the legacy you want to leave, things like that, your unique strengths, your unique genius, because we all have, I'm very much a strengths-based type person. Like I love stuff like the Strengths Finder assessment and things like that. And I like really knowing where do I thrive my best? We all have different circumstances and talents where we thrive best. So that's in that you circle as well. And then also, just keeping in mind what fulfills you. I think entrepreneurs, it's easy if we're not careful to end up in the situation where we feel trapped by our own success, and we don't want that to happen. So constantly staying aware of these criteria, checking back in with them, and keeping them top of mind as we make decisions and decide where to go is really important. Then we come to the audience part of the equation. And obviously, if we have a business, we want to make money. And to make money, we need to create value that people are actively looking for and willing to invest in. And so that means on the audience side of things, we need to know, okay, well, what are their top of mind needs right now? What are they thinking about when they wake up in the morning? What are they thinking about when they go to sleep at night? And at the very least, we need to meet them there. And then we can maybe guide them towards thinking about other things that are important that they might not be thinking about. But it's always, there's this great copywriter had this quote of he said, always enter the conversation already going on in the mind of the customer that you want to reach. So, when you really get into what their experience is, what they've tried before, how aware are they of your solution? Because sometimes, like go back 10, 12, 15 years, if you came out of the gate and said, I'm a paleo coach, people are like, well, what's paleo, right? So the messaging needs to, whereas like today, you can be like, I'm a paleo coach, and they're like, yeah, you and and everyone else, right? So, it's like knowing, that's called market sophistication. Where's the market at right now in terms of their knowledge of what you do? And so when you bring those two things, those two circles together right in the middle, whether you're trying to make a decision about what product to create, what kind of marketing campaign, what kind of messaging, your branding, and whatever the case might be, the contents and so forth, these criteria then inform those decisions. And then in the end, often there might be a number of different ones that still kind of rise to the top. And here's the last little check that I do. And that is I ask myself, okay, if I've narrowed it down to these few things right here, then whatever my goal is, let's say it's to make more money, or to, it could be to grow your audience. It could be to systematize your business more. I ask myself, okay, for each of these strategies, which one has the greatest potential to impact that goal, to move the needle on that goal? Then I ask myself, okay, well, what's the resource and investment intensity of this thing? Like how many hours is it going to take me or me and my team to implement it? Is it going to take months? Is it going to be quicker? So you're kind of just weighing there a little bit too. And sometimes I'm doing this as simple as like in a spreadsheet or on a piece of paper and just kind of scoring them on like a 1 to 5, just because sometimes just doing that and visualizing it, your brain, you immediately get a sense of where your instincts were wanting to land. And then the third one I ask myself is like, well, which one of these am I most jazzed to go with? Which, it's the most excited to try, the most curious to look at. And kind of between those three criteria, once I've come down to that short list, that's how I just, I end up making my final decision on which direction to go. So it's about the Venn diagram to narrow down and align, and then it's about that quick assessment then in the end to decide which one to go with. And then you go with it and you make it the best answer that it could be in that moment. And I'm sure we might talk a bit about more of this too, but I'm always then asking myself, okay, well, what's the simplest, lowest risk, lowest cost, lowest resource required experiment that I can run to test this thing and see if it has legs, to see if it does, all my assumptions, which hopefully were well informed, just to check and see if all my assumptions were true.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about that, because I think oftentimes when we have an idea and we get really excited about it, we tend to jump completely into it and put in systems and fancy course software. And we don't really think about let's do a very low risk, very low cost kind of trial. I think because sometimes we're a little afraid of experimenting in public. Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of, how do you decide how to actually go down that experimentation path? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So there are, first of all, I mean, like I said, you want your experiments to be well informed. So I'll give an example here that might help answer the question that we can kind of dive into. And so I help a lot of, thought leaders, experts, authors, speakers, coaches, consultants, expert service providers to repackage their expertise, their knowledge as new income streams. And often that's in the form of something like some form of online course. And this is an example where I see a lot of people get in trouble with this, where somebody comes to me to work with me and they're like, yeah, I haven't been able to get this thing off the ground. And it's because they've been spending months trying to outline this thing and make it really perfect, and then recording nice videos and recording nice audios and trying to, like you said, get the software together to make a good course platform and all the things that they think that they're supposed to do. And the truth is, eventually, if it's if the experiment proves out, they will want to go down that route. But then what I always end up encouraging my clients to do, or especially somebody who comes to me and they've been stuck in that loop and not getting something out, is I explain, for your business to grow and survive, speed of implementation is everything. If you think about Apple, that first iPhone that went out, I'm guaranteed the engineering team had a list of 20 plus things that they had wished had gone into that iPhone, right? But that didn't make it in there, just because at some point you got to get into the market, into the hands of people. So going back to the online course example, I say we need to launch a pilot course. And a pilot course is something you can get up in a matter of weeks. And what does a pilot course look like? Well, you just need to know who's the student this is going to be for, like who's this for, who's it's not for, what are the outcomes that they're going to get by going through the course, so they know what's in it for them. And hopefully you've done your, I'll get to that in just a second. Hopefully you've done your research there. You have to just basically outline, okay, what's the process to get them from A to B? And maybe you've got like 4 or 5 milestones, and those break down into modules. And then I tell them, you're going to do a series of Zoom calls. You're going to do it as 1 call per week. Each one is one of these modules where you're going to go through a major step, and you then you make recordings through Zoom. You put those onto Google Drive for people to be able to access those recordings. You share that folder with them. If you have any like tools like templates and scripts and worksheets and things like that, just make them in Google Docs. That's perfect, because then you can share with them. They can make a copy. They can fill it out and do what they need. Boom. That's it. Like simple, simple, simple. You can get that to the market fast. Now, and in fact, when it comes to a sales page and a funnel, often it's like just making a Google Doc page. It's like, here are the details of the course. And I just try to get a first handful of people as quickly as possible to go through that. And first of all, see, A, did they buy it? B, was my messaging on point? C, was my process? And then you're testing your process. You're seeing if you're getting the results you want. You're having an iterative relationship of feedback with the people actively using the thing and giving you. And so then in the end, you end up with testimonials, you end up with cash in the door sooner. You end up with information about what that product should be or could be, and how to adjust things. So whether this is a content campaign, whether this is, launching an online course or some other kind of product, it's about that feedback loop to make sure that you haven't missed the mark. And also it ends up being better because of the active input and that you're getting from your marketplace. So that experimentation in front of people is actually what ends up making it that you will have a superior product, again, whether that's a piece of content or whatever the experiment might be. So that's what I would say when it comes to that. And all I can say then is like, yes, then there's that fear, that perfectionism, and these are mindset things to always work on. But one thing I will say is that the more that you get into that mindset of experimentation, maybe it's a bit of like exposure therapy, and you see like how useful that is and how much it saves you time and money and energy in the end, and things end up better. I find that over time, that concern or worry about things going wrong or making a wrong decision goes down and down and down, because you realize I can always pivot and move on to the next version of the experiment if I need.
So speaking of pivot, say we've gone through, we've experimented, we've implemented our idea, and we're trying to figure out whether or not it's working. How do you go about making that evaluation? What kind of data do you keep track of? What factors into your decision on, is it actually working?
Right. Yeah. So I usually try to keep it pretty simple here too. And I just end up choosing 1 or 2 key metrics that will, and that's based on what am I going for? So, for instance, let's say that I'm going to launch let's just say I'm going to launch a podcast, for instance, right? You'd want to, like, some key metrics there. First of all, you need to know what the goals are, because, podcasts are wonderful for a lot of things. And this is where, and again, I'm not, this isn't an episode about launching a podcast, but I think this is a really great example, because a lot of times people will launch a podcast and they're like, well, I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. And I ask them, like, well, what were your goals for the podcast? And, naturally one of them is, well, I wanted visibility. I wanted to reach more people. And that's great. So that's a key metric that you should be watching. But then I also say, well, your podcast is a great networking platform. Like, you can get a lot out of inviting people onto shows, and that's a way to, meet new people, expand your network, cross promote and things like that. Right. So it's like, I could come up with, so audio expansion might be one of my goals. Network expansion might be another goal. Podcast can be a great way to come up with lots of content that then you repurpose and re-syndicate. So point being is you need to know like which of these things is most important. So then you can choose the one or two metrics that are the most important to you. And then, if I was launching a course, then, I said that's a test to see if will people actually buy it? Well, naturally, that's one of the things I'm going to be looking at is, did it sell? Did I sell enough of it the first time out of the gate? And the truth be told, I might only be looking for 6 to 10 or, maybe even 15 sales of that pilot just to, prove that's okay, it sold. And now I know I'm going to get the testimonials and the feedback and all the other good stuff that we talked about out of it. And so, it's not about needing to make tens of thousands of dollars the first time out of the gate. So number one, know what your goal is for the thing. Number two, choose one or two metrics that will be indicative of that. And then the third thing I would say is I like to set a good, better, and best goal, 3 levels of goals. So, let me go back again to the online course example. I might say, well, with my pilot course, for it to be worth my time putting into it, I'd like to make X number of dollars off of it. And again, I try to temper that knowing that, there's a lot of other reasons that I'm doing a pilot and it's not the tens of thousands of dollars right out of the gate. So I set a dollar amount and then I set a slightly higher amount and go, okay, well, so here's the minimum amount that'd be okay, that was time well spent. It's worth proceeding with this experiment. Number two would be oh, I'm really happy. That's a goal that I would have liked to really hit. And then third, the higher level or the best level goal is I'll be jumping out of my seat and dancing if I happen to hit that, right? So I could go and say, okay, I'm going to say 6, 10, and 15 people, booked into this pilot course are my 3 goals for gauging whether or not it was a success. Or going back to the podcast, it could be okay, I'm going to give this 90 days. And here are, if I can get 200 people downloading and listening regularly, that'll be my good level goal. If I can get 400 people in those 90 days, that'll be, the better level goal. And if I can get, 1,000 people, I'll be jumping out of my seat and that'll be my best level goal. So know what you're trying to get out of it. Pick 1 or 2 metrics that then are indicative of that, and then set a good, better, best level of goals are my advice for that.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of some timelines in there, and I think patience is one of those things that's always a struggle for me, and I think for a lot of other entrepreneurs. I want to try something, and then maybe it doesn't work, and I'll just pivot or shift it. But I think a lot of the times I probably didn't give it enough time or effort to really gain traction. So how long do you think you need to give new ideas or new projects or offerings to really tell if they're quote unquote working or not?
Yeah, I mean, this one's a little bit trickier because obviously the launching of a podcast, yeah, you're going to want to give that longer. I mean, I would say minimum of 90 days to kind of gauge where things are at. But then with the pilot course launch, I've gone from idea to putting it out in the market to see what happens in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. And then, if you have a 1 week enrollment launching period where you're trying to, see if you can get people signed up for this thing, you might only need, let's say, a month to know whether or not you've hit your mark or your goal. So the trick is with something like podcasting, and it's the first time that you've launched a podcast and you just don't know what kind of growth to expect or what kind of time period. And that's where you're going to hopefully need, you get informed from outside sources when it's something you're less familiar with, whether that's a coach or a consultant, or maybe you're in a mastermind and somebody in the mastermind has experience doing that thing. And they could say, well, yeah, I didn't really see traction or, noticeable until such and such date or whatever the case may be. But this is also where the podcast goal the podcast example is also an excellent example, because I also, and this kind of goes back to the original question, I also like to see if I can choose an experiment, choose a direction or idea that's going to have multiple layers of potential benefit to me. And so the podcast is a good one because it'd be I'm going for visibility, but I also am going for, creating great content that then I can, turn into other forms of content. I'm also going for the networking. And so if your ultimate goal is the audience building, great, give yourself the 90 days. But at least in the meantime, it's I'm creating all this great content. I can get it transcribed. I can take quotes out of it and create, visual assets for Instagram and other social media channels. I can't, so there. I try to layer in those other things so it doesn't feel like I'm just sitting here doing the thing, waiting for some horizon in the future to tell me whether or not it was worth it. And that's another reason why that criteria of like curiosity and fulfillment and things come in, because then at least I'm enjoying or learning something while I'm going about it and waiting to see if like the numbers turn out. So those are all things that I'm considering in terms of the how long, and of course it's going to vary and get whatever input from others you need if it's just something that you're not familiar with.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And kind of continuing on that, there's this cycle, I think, that happens where you get really excited about a new project and you kick it off, or maybe a new offering. And then somewhere down the track, we hit what Seth Godin calls the dip, that point where you have to decide if you're going to push through the hard thing. Have you given it enough time? Have you put enough effort behind it? Or if it's the right time to just say, hey, that was a failed experiment. So what's your approach to the dip? Like, how do you figure out if you should keep trying or pivot or just quit whatever that thing is?
This is a big question. I think that's one reason. Okay, so here's one thing: is like in the beginning, setting those good, better, best goals and the timelines. One reason why that's important is at least then we know when we're going to check in about it, right? So, because if we, again, using the podcast example, if you didn't do that in the beginning, then let's say, like you said, it's all exciting at first and you're interviewing people and you've got it up and it's in iTunes. Oh, great. And people are, you got some people subscribing and everything. And then after that initial excitement, yeah, you're going to have that dip of motivation perhaps. But if you can look and go, well, when I went into this, according to all my information and what I decided, I said, I'm going to give this so, you have that initial reference point rather than, it'd be a lot easier at that point to like lose motivation and move on to something else if you hadn't taken the time in the beginning to really delineate. It's like, here are the metrics and here's how long I want to give it and things like that. Now, let's say that you have gone the full amount and, you go back and you check your initial goals and numbers. You can just recheck them quickly. Perhaps you've learned some new things in the meantime and you look at your good, better, best goals and you're like, yeah, those actually weren't very reasonable, and maybe I do need to give it some. Now that I'm understand even more in doing this and stuff, I need to give it a little bit more time to know whether or not I'm going to be able to hit those numbers. I think it is important to check in with yourself and your own fulfillment and motivation and things like that. But if that's the only thing that's helping you decide whether or not to continue, then that's where I think we're a little more likely to get pulled to and fro by just kind of our own feelings and reactions in the moment. So there's this thing that I do, this thing that I say to myself in those moments that, I tell myself, I can trust my past self, and that when you do shift gears too quickly, you're essentially kind of throwing your own self and intuition under the bus by second guessing the decisions that your past self made, and put all this effort into in the moment to go, okay, this is, all the things we talked about already in this conversation, to do all the research and the alignment and the setting of goals and all those things. And it, if you just move on, then it's like, well, so when things do get hard, I try to remind myself, it's like, look, I can trust my intuition. I had this certain intuition and decision making in the past. So it's worth keeping going in this moment. Now, there are those times where it's like you look at it and it's like, okay, yeah, this just is not turning out how I expected. And I think it's also good to get outside perspective in those moments, because we can get so sucked into our own thinking and all the blinders come on, and various things can then help us or keep us from seeing what might be going that's going well, or maybe even seeing that it's like, yeah, you know what, you can cut yourself a break here. Like, you've done everything you can, and this just is not going the direction that you want it to. So that's where it's really good to just know, like, who can you turn to for that trusted, but be very careful about who you ask, right? Because people are going to have their own biases and things. So it's like, that's where having a good coach or a mastermind that they're going to ask you good questions, and they're going to have your best intentions and not just try to sound smart with their answer and things like that. But I think getting outside perspective is really important in those moments as well.
No, I agree. So going back to how long you think things should take, or how long you should give the experiment, or how invested you should be in the experiment, do you think it matters the size of your audience? So if you have a bigger audience, can you test for a shorter amount of time? Or you think that it really has no impact. And even with a really, really small audience, you can still do quick, short tests.
Well, audience size is a resource like anything, just like money. And so whenever you inject more resources into a test, typically, I mean, it depends. Some things just need time and there's no changing that. But typically you can test something more quickly. So let's take another example. If you have some new messaging, I went back to that whole thing of audience. You have to enter the conversation already going in the mind of your market. And so let's say you've decided, yeah, you know what, I need to shift up my messaging a bit because of things that have shifted in the market. And so I'm going to make a new lead magnet, a new PDF downloadable freebie that I'm going to put out there in order to try building my list. And so in a lot of ways like that, I mean, that's an experiment for some new messaging. And in fact, I think it's one of the best ways to test new messaging is to put together some kind of resource and then see how your audience or how people on social media or the market you want to reach respond. Are they eagerly going and entering their email and downloading it, or are you getting good feedback and things like that? So clearly, if you've got several thousand people on a list and you send that out to your list and see, look at some numbers like downloads or even have them re-opt in to get this new thing, you're going to get data a lot faster and you're going to get feedback from people and hopefully people emailing you, or if you ask for feedback, a lot more like a lot quicker. But if you've got a smaller audience, and that might mean, well, like if somebody's just starting out and just starting to build a list and maybe they have a network and some reputation and things like that, they're going to have to, so to speak, pound the pavement a little bit more, like get out there on social media or run some ads or, something like that in order to get enough eyeballs on the thing to find out if it's really resonating with the marketplace. So there are plenty of cases where, yes, absolutely, an audience, just like money or anything, is a resource that you put into the experiment and that can accelerate it. Just like money would accelerate a campaign by putting money into paid ads. It's like you can go with organic, which is going to take longer, organic traffic and reaching people, or you can put money into paid ads and that's going to accelerate how quickly you get data. And so money, audience size, these are just resources that they do help with experiments.
That makes sense. So I think time frame is important, but are there any systems or tactics or practical strategies that you personally use or that you use with clients to kind of encourage a little bit of patience, or at least kind of counteract that tendency to step off the track just before you could really reach the full potential? Because I know I've done that, where you're like, oh, this thing is going really well, and then you just kind of shift focus out of fear of success or fear of, the next step, fear of getting a little bit bigger. How do you counteract that tendency to just step off the track too soon?
So a couple things come to mind. I mean, yeah, with my clients, if they're getting impatient, I mean, in a lot of ways they're relying on my expertise to help them decide if we've put enough time and resources into the experiment. And so, sometimes it's as simple as me just saying like, yeah, I can understand that you might be getting impatient here, but we need more data. So we need to keep going for another week, or we need to get another 100 people to look at this, or we need to, right? So in that case, they're just relying on my expertise, and hopefully they've hired me for a reason and are going to trust that intuition just because, I might have more expertise with, I've been podcasting for 15 years and I've been launching online courses for 15 years. So that perspective is coming into play. And that's, why I'm encouraging others to get outside perspective before they do make any major decisions. Here's another little tip that comes to mind too that I think can help with motivation. A lot of times when we're losing motivation, it's because we feel like we're not seeing results yet. And this would have been a good thing to mention earlier, that when I have projects like this and I set goals, I keep in mind that there are two different types of goals you can set, and I try to set both types. And I call these outcome goals and execution goals. So outcome goals, which is I think what we've mostly been talking about here, it's like how many people sign up for the course, or how many people download the thing, or let's say, so you're trying to give a certain amount of time to see in the end if you reached your good, better, best, one of those, if you fell into that range of numbers. But the problem is, let's say you need, 2 months, 3 months to get there and see if the outcome was right, is that in the moment right now, you're just kind of sitting here wondering if it's headed in the right direction. So that's where execution goals can be helpful, not only to keep you on track, but also to have something you're looking at that keeps you motivated in the moment. So what do I mean by an execution goal? Where execution goals are like, what are the things you can track that lead hopefully to the outcome? So for instance, an easy example here would be like if you're doing some kind of exercise regimen or something to lose weight, and losing weight is an outcome goal. And there's a lot of variables that affect that. So you can say, I want to lose 10 pounds in 3 months or whatever, but there's a lot of things that are going to affect whether or not that happens. But in execution, you can say, well, the things I need to do on a daily basis are track my calories, and do some kind of physical activity. And so in tracking that on a day-to-day basis, you can see, are you on track and actually doing the things that will give you the best chance of reaching the outcome? But then also I think our minds like to have that feedback now that we're doing the right kinds of things, that the right kinds of things are happening. If we can see that on the I sometimes people talk about, this doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but sometimes people talk about having the calendar if you're doing a new daily habit and like Xing, every day, so you can see this chain of X's that are, so that's tracking execution that leads to the outcome. So there's another piece of advice I can put out there, because I do think that our mind at times needs that additional input just to feel like we're on the right track and not just wonder like, are we, just throwing resources at nothing here just to discover that we've missed the mark.
Yeah, I love the idea of the execution goals, because then you have something to go back to and say, well, it didn't work. And you can go back and say, did I do the things that I said I needed to do to make this work? Oh, I didn't do the things. Well, that might be why it didn't actually work. Because I think you're right. I think we tend to focus on the outcomes and then sometimes forget that there are specific actions that we need to take to make that outcome happen.
Right.
That it's not just going to magically appear. People aren't just going to magically sign up for your course or listen to your podcast without you remembering to tell them about it.
Right. Well, and I want to reinforce here too that I always try to have multiple reasons why I'm doing a thing. So, if I'm waiting to see if I'm going to get the kind of downloads I want for the podcast, if in the meantime I can be, I can say, well, what's going to keep me really excited? I ask myself this question all the time. What is going to keep me excited and engaged and in this project while I'm waiting for the outcomes? And I always know that, the curiosity is something that feeds me a lot. Novelty feeds me a lot. So maybe I decide that one thing that'll keep me engaged in the podcast for 3 months while I'm waiting to see how the numbers turn out is, if I make a list of, well, here are the people I would just love to talk to on my podcast. And I'm just very deliberate about choosing people that will be energizing for me to interview on the podcast. Or, maybe I decide, hey, it would be really fun for those 3 months to try out a few different formats and see what that's like. And that's kind of a sort of another experiment, but maybe just that novelty is interesting to you as you're starting a new project, and like you can try out different segments. And, so if your mind works well with being creative and novel in that way, then great. Like you can change it up along the way while still waiting to see if the ultimate outcome goals, hit for you or not. Or maybe something completely different. Like, hey, what would be fun is if I compose my own music for my podcast, and it's like this, personal, maybe you're dabbling in songwriting. That's just a personal goal thing that you've got going on, and you can infuse that into your podcast experiment. Then, those are the kinds of things too that help keep you motivated. And if you can layer on multiple reasons why and multiple things that will feed you and your business as you're waiting to see if the thing will pan out.
No, I love that. So is there anything that you think we should talk about that we haven't actually touched on yet?
No, this has been some really good stuff. And I'll just mention, I think something that ties it together nicely is there's a great article a few years back in Harvard Business Review, and the title, the headline of the article was something like, business. We need to look at business strategy as a hypothesis. Business. There was like business or strategy is a hypothesis, not a plan, or something like that, right? So often we talk about, especially in business, having a strategic plan, and we think of it as this, like, okay, how am I going to get B? I want to get to point B, and I'm at point A, and what's that line that's going to get me from A to B? And we set our goals, and we set our timelines and all those things, and put together to-dos and track that stuff. However, yeah, it doesn't work out that way. It never is a straight line. There's always things, there's always going to be some element of we don't know what we don't know. And so really the point of this article is like, we just need to look at strategy as a series of hypotheses. And we need to talk about it more in that way, because that's the reality of how businesses grow, how initiatives are put into play. And so, that kind of, I think, sums up what we're getting at in this conversation here, is that more that you can encourage yourself to look at growing your business or whatever pursuit you're doing in life as a series of hypotheses, that it's just going to work out better in the end.
Oh, I love that. I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up. So where can our listeners find you if they want to connect or learn more about what you do?
So one good place, if they're listening to this podcast, I imagine they like listening to podcasts, and I have a podcast of my own that I call Impact. And it's all about how to grow a thought leadership-based business and brand. And in each episode, I share a specific framework that will help you in some way to establish and grow that brand, income, impact, things like that. So you can find that at my website, jasonvanorden.com. And then in the navigation, there's a podcast. Click on that, and then you can just find it on any of the major podcasting platforms. And so I would love them to check that out if they want to hear more of this kinds of stuff on a variety of different related topics.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Going into a new project, having a clear idea of what your benchmarks for success are lets you know whether what you're working on is actually, working. Having goals around execution tells you whether or not you're actually giving this project a legitimate shot to succeed. And when you're at the beginning of a project, figuring out what you need to invest in terms of time and resources can help systematize your patience. If you know that it's going to take at least 6 months for something to pay off, you can build in execution goals that take that into account. And those goals become the structure that can keep you trucking when the impatient part of you wants to pull up the stakes and pivot. Another tool that I've used to make sure that I'm being patient is to pull in an expert. Somebody who does this kind of project all the time, so they can help calibrate my expectations for how long something will take. I am horrible at actually estimating that, so having a professional in my corner helps me keep on track and helps reaffirm that our timeline is realistic. Remember, your project is just a hypothesis about something that might work. Collecting data around that hypothesis allows you to make better decisions the next time around. It allows you to evaluate what happened and see if you really are just being impatient or if this idea was something that legitimately didn't work. And using that data, you can figure out how to do it better the next time around. But if you listened to this episode and thought, well, that's interesting, but I never seem to manage to start anything in the first place, next week's episode with Charlie Gilkey on procrastination is for you. So make sure you hit subscribe in your favorite podcast player so you don't miss it. Break the Ceiling is produced by Yellow House Media. Our production coordinator is Sean McMullen. This episode is edited by Marty Seafeld with production assistance by Kristen Grunbeck.